As the protege approached the mountaintop, he heard a voice call out. "What is it that Pokemon players value most?" asked the master. "Is it the intellect of a genius design? If it were simply the beauty of creation, would we not laud it regardless of whether we'd seen a similar design before? But we don't. Given two designs, players give greater acclaim to the concept that came first. It's not the beauty itself players admire, it's not innovation, aesthetics, or capacity. The greatest trait players value seems to me that it must be nothing more than novelty." He drew a single Pokeball, and I came before all. When you think of the word gimmick in Pokemon, you probably think of Mega Evolutions, Z-Moves, G-Max, and Terastallization. But what if I told you that Pokemon itself, the entire franchise, is actually a gimmick? A gimmick is nothing more than a device or feature used to attract attention. But as the franchise has matured, the term has become synonymous with big flashy Pokemon forms. In Pokemon's quest to stay relevant, it walks a tightrope between adding interesting new functions and ensuring these functions have real value. And today we're going to explore the history of Pokemon gimmicks throughout the series, seeing where Game Freak slowly went wrong and how they managed to course correct it and fix the issue. Oh, and celebrating the release of Pokemon ZA, we'll be giving away 5 copies of the game. To enter, just subscribe and watch to the end. Now, if we jump all the way back to the original Pokemon Red, Blue, Green, and Yellow, we can get an idea of how gimmicks originally started to better understand their evolution. It's funny to think now, but in Generation 1, the gimmick is Pokemon themselves. Pocket monsters, animals that you capture and battle with and become your friends. These are a gimmick. And that's because Pokemon games are really just a reskin of the traditional JRPG. In your traditional RPG, you might be deciding whether you want a fire, grass, or water mage to join your team. But where Pokemon found its novelty is that it basically just recontextualized these traditional RPG roles into animals that become your friend. Pokemon is just an entire reskin of what was already a tried and true formula. It blended a new idea with something familiar to create novelty. And this is going to be a really important concept to understand as we go through every single generation. We as humans value novelty. Media that does not evolve becomes boring, but we tend to only like novelty to a certain extent up to the point where things stop being familiar. And this is the great challenge that the Pokemon series has faced since its inception. And so with this understanding, we can now move forward as we see Game Freak take its first step onto the tightrope and begin its decades-long walk in remaining novel. Generation 2. Imagine you're Game Freak and you just created Gen 1 Pokemon. You're this small studio that sells 46 million copies worldwide. Okay, that is more than any other game will go on to sell. Where do you go from here? Well, at the time, the creators thought they had a fad on their hands. Game Freak were not expecting Pokemon to evolve into this super mega franchise and planned to just milk one more game before all the hype ended. And I do think this helps explain Gen 2's design to a certain extent. Because Gen 2 kind of sells itself on just like having a ton of new stuff, regardless of if it's all good. First, you've got the day and night cycle, which is an entirely new system based on your real in-game clock. It adds a new level of dynamics to the way you play. There's tons of smaller things too, like shiny Pokemon and animated sprites. Breeding opens up a whole new realm for replayability. You've also got features like the Steel and Dark type and held items. Despite being primarily added for game balance, these were all advertised as new, fun, and exciting features. Updated graphics on top of all this makes for a game that feels incredibly fresh and polished from the original. But if there's one thing that most defines the attentional device of Generation 2, it's actually once again the Pokemon themselves. Gen 2's gimmick is the addition of 100 brand new Pokemon. It's like, you like Pokemon? We'll get ready for Pokemon 2. Electric Chinchou. You remember early road Pokemon? Well, check out Rattata 2. We got new birds. We got new legendary birds. Oh, and check out the new Mewtwo. Mewtwo 2 and Mewtwo 3. You remember your old favorites like Onix? Wait, you didn't like Onix? Yeah, same here, but don't worry, he gets a new evolution. Scyther gets an evolution. Seadra gets an evolution. Poliwhirl and Slowpoke, second evolutions. And you thought Pikachu was cute? Well, say hello to baby Pikachu. Baby Electabuzz, baby Jinx, baby Magmar, baby baby. The concept that there could be more Pokemon than the original 151 was actually a crazy idea at the time. And while Gen 2 obviously had a lot of issues in distributing these Pokemon, they still defined the games, which is another great creative example of keeping one foot in familiarity as you branch out. When the more tame Kanto decks and spicier Gen 2 decks are combined, the Johto roster feels like the perfect blend of iconic and interesting characters. Okay, so that does it for Gen 2. We are building up and towards Gen 6, where this is all going to come together and make so much sense, I promise. So as a young franchise, Gen 2 had a lot of room to grow, and the result is that it gets a lot of praise for trying new ideas at a time where new ideas were kind of a dime a dozen. We are also trying new ideas, guys, just literally trying to bring you like the absolute biggest banger videos we can. If you'd subscribe to help out the team, it would mean a lot. Generation 3. Now with Hoenn, we got another brand new set of 135 Pokemon. And I think that the key distinction between Gen 2 and 3 is that while new Pokemon are still a gimmick in the sense that they draw attention, they're no longer the gimmick. The idea of more new Pokemon it doesn't have the oomph that Gen 2 did. Instead, Gen 3's roster manages to differentiate the formula by seeing Hoenn center staging their new cast. While Johto's encounter table is pretty much just Kanto plus, Gen 3's decks feels like a soft reset. And this is the foundational concept that defines Hoenn. Johto had new Pokemon, but Hoenn is the first fresh new Pokemon experience. So the way the new dex is implemented is an attention-grabbing novel device, but it's not the only new feature. Now, Weather was introduced in Gen 2, but it was placed so far on the back burner that it was practically sitting inside the walls of the game. In Gen 3, Game Freak finally fleshes it out, going so far to create the games around legendaries that control the weather. It's a huge part of the storyline, various bosses use weather effectively, and there are tons of areas affected by the climate itself. But I think because this was made in Gen 2 and feels like a genuine improvement to the gameplay, this doesn't come off as feeling like a gimmick. The second idea that in retrospect could be viewed as the inklings of gimmicks are actually abilities. Similar to both Megas or even something like a Pokemon getting a Dark or Steel typing, abilities are a new functional part that makes up a Pokemon. They add a level of dynamics to the gameplay, which helps make Pokemon capable of being good without relying on things like just stats. It's a cool, fresh new idea, but this is a very foundationally important concept that is not grounded in just novelty. It is function first and foremost, but Game Freak takes advantage of this function by introducing it in a way that garners attention. On top of the weather ability legendaries, you've also got things like your dad's slacking, which kind of takes its entire identity from its ability. Now, like every game, we also have some smaller sort of side ideas that get added, things like secret bases, contests, the trick house, and so on. But this is all just like fun side feature fluff. I like contests. I don't think they're like imperative to the game. There's just something about these sort of side features that don't really feel like cheap gimmicks, almost just because they're like transparent. It's like, this is just side stuff. Have fun with it. It's not relevant to like the main game. I actually think the one thing that most closely resembles like modern day gimmick stigma in Generation 3 are double battles. Now, that's not to say that double battles are cheap. Probably like one of the single most innovative ideas in the series, actually. But they feel cheap in the way they're introduced, specifically in Ruby and Sapphire. All random trainer double battles are optional to the point where it's quite easy to just entirely miss them. Meanwhile, the only mandatory double fight is Tate and Liza, who have 2 Pokemon. And so because the feature doesn't really get to show itself off, its lack of commitment to what's actually a pretty big idea, it just kind of left players without much of an opinion for it. And something that's big enough to like be featured in a gym battle, well, the way that it's not good, but just fresh, that kind of makes it feel like a gimmick. It's only in Emerald where this actually gets used properly and begins to show that it's an innovation of real and like serious value. And I think this goes to show like how important the implementation of new ideas are. If even a good idea is introduced poorly, its lack of perceived value will lead players to assume a lack of actual value. So hopefully you can kind of start to see how we're putting the pieces together towards what will eventually lead into a very big issue. Generation 4. I think it's only in Sinnoh where you can start to see innovation first hitting a point of diminishing returns. If a standard JRPG to Gen 1 is the giant leap, the jump to Gen 2 is smaller but still huge. Gen 3, still huge but smaller still. And Gen 3 to Gen 4 is like, oh, okay, I can finally start to see this like all coming together. Gen 4 has less new features, but instead it sees a lot of focus put into fine-tuning and optimizing existing features. Like when I think of Gen 4, I don't really think of it having a bunch of new stuff, more so just doing stuff really well. It's got those fundamentals. For the first time, you've got solid learn sets, a roster with a wide number of usably good Pokemon, solid opponent team building, the best level curve to date, and on and on. The result is obviously an amazing game, but what are, if any, the attention devices? Well, Sinnoh's Dex is far from out of the ordinary. It's got some of the best designs in the series, but the overall framing of the lineup doesn't feel that different from past gens. Sinnoh feels like a mixed inspiration between Hoenn's center staging new members and Johto's expansion of pre-existing ideas. Like Hoenn, the foundation sits on new pivotal members like Staraptor, Luxray, Roserade, Garchomp, and on. But at the same time, Sinnoh kind of does the Johto thing where it like expands on old ideas. You've got stronger forms of Magmar, Rhydon, Togetic, Electabuzz, and many more. So in a big way, the Sinnoh roster stands on the shoulders of Johto, delivering a lot of really good Pokemon. Outside of this, you've got Wi-Fi connectivity for battles and events. This is like the only thing Game Freak found important enough that they would not only put it in the big text on the back of the box besides 100 new Pokemon, but also added it on the front of the box right next to the Nintendo DS logo. And it kind of feels like it was marketed the same way as double battles were in Gen 3. They're plastered everywhere as this massive thing, but in reality, the actual functionality in-game is pretty minor despite how much it's actually advertised. And it would really take until the competitive scenes for this great feature to actually blow up. And these are all really interesting new ideas, but they're very much side concepts. There's also the physical special split. For the first time ever, all moves finally have an individual physical or special attribute rather than be determined by the move's type. This was a massively beneficial feature for the quality of gameplay and balance, brings enough newness to many Pokemon and moves, and did garner a lot of attention, but it is, of course, still another function first improvement. And so in the end, Sinnoh doesn't really put its emphasis on new features. It's just put its effort into improving the core components like story, enemies, Pokemon, and progression. And, you know, the result is the game heralded for being one of the best in the series. And while we're not really focused on remakes for this video, Heart Gold Soul Silver is specifically interesting because it kind of does the opposite. If you're a Gen 2 fan, you know that Heart Gold Soul Silver did very little to fix the underlying fundamentals of Gen 2. The level curve is still awful. There's a ton of Pokemon that still aren't available before Lance. And as a Gen 2 lover, I get frustrated with this because it feels like Heart Gold Soul Silver really focused on novelty over function. Like, yeah, Heart Gold Soul Silver vibes are peak. Crazy story animations like Ho-Oh, follower Pokemon. There's so much that are amazing about these games, and yet I get frustrated by them because they prioritized all these novel features before working on those fundamentals. So Gen 4 further helps us to build our foundational understanding of what goes wrong once we get to Generation 6. We are so close with just one more generation to go. Generation 5. At its core, Unova shares a lot with the Gen 4 titles, mainly in that both have a focus on polished mechanics rather than adding new features. This again, though, doesn't mean that Gen 5 didn't experiment. Gen 5 does the biggest soft reset of the series yet, with the main game only featuring new Unovan Pokemon. This gives it a fresh feel by forcing players to use brand new Pokemon, and while this again leans more in the direction of a gameplay functional mechanic, it's certainly both a novelty device and selling feature of the game. Gen 5 also has some really cool smaller features. Seasons add a whole new level of dynamicism to both the encounters and the world itself. There were also a new battle function in the Held Gems. This is overall a pretty small new item, but it does kind of go on to inspire a much bigger idea. Gems are single-use held items that boost the power of a move of its type by 50%. I feel like these could have been made into a really big deal, but they were very much sidelined and just kind of left to the player to discover on their own. don't. But there is one feature in Gen 5 that feels like, I don't know, this kind of might be the first like cheap attention device. This is, of course, the introduction of triple and rotational battles. So to start, these highly complex battles do see praise for their high level of strategy required to fight in them. But I think the number one reason people praise these is kind of just simply that they're different. People like them more just because they're something new, more than their actual functional value. Because for every fan of these features, I always see someone else criticizing them for being too complex. I think the fairest criticism is that these things are so complicated that most players just end up kind of mashing A until the fight is over. I agree, but I also just think they're incredibly half-baked. Like, these are in the main stories even less than doubles were in Ruby and Sapphire, and they're just kind of there. Now, if you go through forums and Reddit and all that stuff, you will see people actually note these battles as being one of the first gimmicks, but it's pretty rare, and I think that's mainly just because they're not really in the games that much. Now listen, we've come a long way. Let's take a step back. Note that this point marks the end of the non-gimmick era. Throughout these 5 gens, we have seen tons of new ideas, with some holding on and some being let go of. This was the era of Pokemon fleshing itself out and establishing exactly what it wants to be. But it's right here. As the formula is perfected, we see a huge shift in tone from the series. Because once you've got a perfect formula, well, you gotta innovate. And having taken and used already so many of those good ideas, hopefully you can understand what a tricky spot Game Freak was actually in. Like, dude, how do you follow up Black and White and Black and White 2? The further they went down this tightrope, the harder things got to balance. And so to one-up themselves, in Gen 6, Game Freak takes their biggest swing yet. And guys, it's an absolute success. Unfortunately, that success would come with a mountain of even larger issues. Generation 6. Kalos' jump to 3D graphics marks the most obvious shift in the series, but it's really just the tip of the iceberg. Because in a less obvious sense, the series also sees a big change in design philosophy. If you follow the trend between generations, Gen 1 to 2, 2 to 3, 3 to 4, and 4 to 5 all feel like they make a logical next step. There's something about the step to Gen 6 that just feels different. Suddenly the games feel a bit easier, a bit more childish. There's a whole lot of nostalgia baiting. The games are really holding your hand. The new roster is mid. There's just this weird presence looming over my shoulder the entire experience. Oh wait, no, that's because there is. Gen 6 sees the highest level of devotion to a new singular idea. Like no other gen before it, Mega Evolution is synonymous with Gen 6. From the storyline to the gameplay, you just can't really pull one from the other. And this has a pretty crazy effect on not just the games, but how the series would be perceived moving forward forever. But before we get to that, let's actually look at what Mega Evolution is. It's easy to get caught up in the visual spectacle of it all, but at its core, this new mechanic is really just power forms. You've seen new types, new abilities, the physical special splits, and now Generation 6's big new innovation to gameplay is power forms. But I think we could actually dissect it even further. To paint my example, let's look at Electabuzz. In Generation 4, they added a new, harder, better, faster, stronger looking evolution to this line called Electivire. In the business, that's what we call a cross-generational evolution. But let me paint it this way. If you introduced Electivire in Generation 6 and called it Mega Electabuzz, how would that reframe your view of the Pokemon? By Gen 6, additional evolution stages had been done. We'd seen the Kingdras, the Porygon 2s and Zs, the Magmortars. And so Mega's kind of just reframed this package into something that feels newer than it actually is. Electivire versus Mega Electabuzz, it's very similar, but there are a few subtle changes to the formula that make Megas just so genius. The first way that Megas frame themselves differently is that the Pokemon keeps its name. Rather than introducing a new Pokemon that you have to now get reattached to, by keeping the name, you keep the familiarity. Like take Mega Swampert. Imagine if this was a 4th evolution called Swamp Brawn. It's actually not a bad name at all. The point is, no longer is this your buddy that you've used to stomp Hoenn over a dozen times. I don't know who the hell this Swamp Brawn is. Oh, Mega Swampert though? Yeah, that's my boy. It's just Swampert, and he's in his mega form. The naming itself is a subtle reframing to make a new design feel more familiar. But there's something to be said for the mechanic itself, because you don't walk around with a Mega Swampert, you still walk around with Swampert. It's just that when you go into battle, you get this new extra cool form. So that's another way that the familiarity is kept. There's also just the stat boost itself. Those new evolutions like Magmortar, like they didn't really go even up to 550 in base stats. Mega evolutions though get way stronger to the point where they are like legendaries. And so that's another way that helps make them feel a lot more fresh. Am I overanalyzing this? Maybe a little bit, but if you don't understand it at like its base core, the rest of what Game Freak is going to introduce won't really make sense. The point is, Mega Evolution is a new take on something not quite as original as you might think. They are, however, very, very smart. But remember how we've talked about implementation being a really important aspect to this? What did I say? Good ideas are nothing without proper implementation. Well, sadly, this is where Game Freak falls into trouble, because this would end up being an idea that would leave its mark rippling across the series for over a decade to come. The first criticism that Mega see is that the Pokemon who received Mega Evolutions were oftentimes the ones that were already strong. Mega Kanto starters, Mega Lucario, Gengar, Alakazam, Gardevoir, Pseudos, and so on. Instead of being implemented to help balance underperforming yet loved Pokemon, they instead made the gap in power between weak and strong even worse. And this is unfortunately a tricky thing to balance. It would fairly be weird to only give weak Pokemon Mega Evolutions. It would result in a really flat power curve. It might not be the biggest selling point. But if you just think about how, let's say, abilities help to balance a ton of Pokemon like a Azumarill or an early route catch like Mightyena or Swellow, Megas take a very different approach. And this is the first aspect that makes Megas feel like a function that was added for novelty and not as something to benefit the game. Second issue is that the bulk of Mega Stones are only available in the post game. Most players will experience Mega Lucario, a Mega Starter, and there's like, what else? Aerodactyl, Ampharos, Abomasnow, and Gengar. This has a really weird effect on the game where like everyone plays basically the same experience. Third, the mechanic itself is just really overpowered. There's no limit to how long a Mega could stay alive for, and there's no limit to how many fights you could actually use Mega Evolution. It just feels weird that I can make my Mega Lucario go Super Saiyan 3 the moment a Bunnelby looks at me the wrong way. And I think it also leads to the mechanic feeling less significant when you're using it for the hard fights of the game. But I think we could look past a lot of these criticisms if there were just more Mega Pokemon on enemy teams. Like if X and Y was actually so hard that you needed something like a Mega Lucario to beat it, would be like, okay, fair. You raise the difficulty of the fights, you raise the power of the Pokemon that you get access to, that's just more fun. But because these games are on the easy side, even without Megas, it just leaves you with a feeling of like, why did you even add this? I actually did a run on my second channel using no Megas and only Kalos Pokemon, and it was still not even that hard. But with all that said, let's bring it back to today's topic and just consider how the introduction of Megas brought the idea of a gimmick to the forefront of players' minds. Megas show us the importance of implementation. While they are a great idea, the way that Megas were introduced makes them feel like they were added for novelty and not feature. Like ask yourself, if Dark-type was removed from Generation 2, would those games be worse? Absolutely yes. Made for a cool boss, made Psychics not as broken. How about an Emerald? Would that game be less without the Tate and Liza fight? Yeah, but if Megas were removed from their introductory game, well, yeah, sure, you'd lose some flash, but the actual gameplay might be better. But, you know, at the end of the day, I mean, this is a lot of nerdy criticisms, and to the casual population, Megas were loved. But what I think is important to finish on is just what an issue this even success had on the series. You implement an idea and it's got a 15 out of 10 cool factor. That alone makes for a pretty hard follow-up. And when you have something this popular, there is an understandable desire to recreate it. But what do you do when that successful idea was also one of the sloppiest features ever added to your game? See, this right here is how novelty, not just gimmicks, but player obsession with novelty almost ruined Pokemon. In our need for novelty and expansion within these games, and a corporation's single-minded drive to make money was a monster created. But over the next 3 generations of Pokemon, we'll look at how Game Freak not just tamed, but actually controlled and utilized this monster to full effect. Generation 7. I want to start this section by reminding you that Megas are not a feature. Power Forms were a mechanical feature, and Megas were Gen 6's packaging of that idea. From here on out, we are simply going to see Game Freak experiment with variations of the Mega, or Power Form. And so in a bigger sense, we've now made it to the final form of the communal sense of the word gimmick. While there are new stuff still being added to the game, each gen from here on out has a power form that kind of takes precedence as the attentional device for its generation. And what's really interesting about Gen 7 is that it actually deconstructs the packaging of the Mega into 2 new separate, more balanced ideas. The first half we got from the splitting of the Mega was the regional form. Regional form follows Mega's idea of taking a familiar Pokemon and giving it a new form while retaining familiarity. Like with Megas, instead of building a brand new Pokemon, you use the clout of a previous Pokemon like Rattata. Can't believe I just said Rattata has clout. Listen, the point is, you introduce Darkrat. That's stupid. I don't want Darkrat, but oh my gosh, a Alolan Rattata? That's sick. I will now buy your game. The clever idea, but interestingly, is never really talked about as a gimmick. And that's probably because it was implemented so organically. A lot of tropical looking variants of Pokemon on a tropical island. Yeah, that's just cool. Now, this leads us to the second half of the splitting of the Mega, which are, of course, Z-moves. Z-moves are a once-per-battle attack that feels like a combination between an offensive bowling animation and a final smash in Smash Bros. They're ridiculous, high power, and over the top, and from the gameplay aspect, the jump from Mega to Z-moves was actually a very well-considered decision. Think about this from a just trying to beat your opponent perspective. What's the difference between your Mega Lucario using a normal Pokemon attack versus a normal Lucario firing off a Z-move? Well, it's actually not that different. Over the course of one single offensive turn, the end result is both a dead opponent. No, seriously, guys, I think some of these Z-moves are actually killing Pokemon. That dude fell into a 1,000-foot chasm. So over the course of a single turn, they're really not that different. What made Megas so overpowered is that their form lasts as long as they remain alive. Might be one turn, but when you're rocking legendary level stats, it's often more likely gonna be 10. That opens up a variation that's difficult to balance. Since Z-moves happen one turn for one battle, their low variability makes them much easier to balance the game around. Another issue with Megas is that only some Pokemon got these power forms. Z-moves bring power forms to every Pokemon in the game, giving weaker Pokemon and less loved Pokemon a chance to try and shine. Z-moves also scale in power. The moment you get a Mega Evolution, you've got stats higher than the legendary trios and mythicals. There is no curve, it is just straight up wall. The damage of a Z-move is based off the base power of the regular move in its slot. So as you scale through the game, Z-moves grow from 100 power on 55 base power moves to 200 for 140 plus power moves. And as far as implementation goes, Z-moves are well balanced in their games. The games are made more difficult to account for the fact that you have Z-moves. Z-moves are actually useful for the difficulty that Sun and Moon and Ultra Sun and Moon pose. So under the hood, you can look at Z-moves like an incredible balance patch to the power form. Unfortunately, Z-moves do not get a lot of love. First, smaller issue is that we kind of already saw Z-moves. Z-moves really aren't much more than just gems that go burr. And so I understand that fans feel like this isn't even really a new idea. But the larger issue that Z-moves have is basically the opposite of Megas. Megas were poorly implemented, but extremely cool. Z-moves were actually well implemented and just not cool at all. Think about it this way. You're 8 years old. Would you rather the full package that is Mega Charizard, complete with a new design, ability, etc.? Or do you just want a Charizard using Infernal Overdrive? Or hey, why don't we play a game? What's your favorite Z move? You big fan of Twinkle Tackle? Or maybe you prefer Savage Spinout? Now listen, to be fair, some are sick, like Shattered Psyche. Damn, that name and animation goes so hard. But as a whole, Z-moves don't hold a candle to Mega Evolutions. So at the end of the day, it's just a tough hand that Z-moves got dealt. Megas are a tough act to follow. For the sake of the game, Z-moves correctly reined it in, but in balancing the mega mess, they end up just not really being nearly as cool. And so the result is that they're just seen by the community as cheap because people look at them as the successor to Megas. And it's kind of sad because I view Z-moves as just an imperfect attempt to balance an incredibly broken feature. Generation 8. So stepping back here, in your quest to innovate, you create something that feels like it's going to have a lasting shadow on the series forever. It's here where Game Freak feels like they really painted themselves into a corner. Where do you go from here? Well, in Galar, we're going to see something that spiritually feels like the game design equivalent of clutching the last Easter egg step in COD Zombies. Of course, though, when all your teammates are down and it's like round 300. Anyway, the point is, Game Freak takes everything that made Megas and Z-moves good and repackages it into something that feels brand new. Enter the Dynamax era. A lot of people look at Dynamax and go, yeah, that's nothing more than just a cheap attempt to copy Megas where the Pokemon gets big. I understand if you think that, but if you still think that after this video, I am going to bonk you on the nose. I will die on the hill that Dynamax is genius. It pulls inspiration from Megas through a power boost in stats, specifically HP. And funnily enough, HP is actually the only stat that isn't affected by Mega Evolution. But second, Dynamax Pokemon gain access to a set of moves called Max Moves. The type and base power of Max Moves depend on the move it knew before Dynamaxing, and on all senses, they are the successor to Z Moves. So Megas, Z Moves, boom. But this feature draws on two other key components. Game Freak also added a second, more rare type of Dynamax called Gigantamax. This is very similar to Dynamax, but the Pokemon gets its very own special design, along with a special move that Dynamax Pokemon can't get. The genius here is that you get the novelty factor of a new form that Megas gave you, but Pokemon that don't get Gmax forms aren't completely left in the dust. And while Gmax is clearly the true successor to Mega Evolution, it's importantly relegated to only being available after the 8th gym. Gym leaders all get Gmax Pokemon to make them more of a challenge, but the player has to wait because Game Freak knew they would break the game. Does that sound like maybe learning from your mistakes? The player, though, instead gets Dynamax. You get something, but not everything. Importantly, you also only really get to use the mechanic inside of gyms. And adding to the balance, both forms can also only stay in the power state for 3 turns. This draws inspiration from the once per battle function of Z moves, but gives more staying power to the idea. 3 turns makes the moment a little bit more epic and big, especially again when it's only relegated to like an occasional fight. So I just think people who say that Gmax is a bad idea and a gimmick haven't really thought about it. If you only look at the actual designs, it's easy to miss just how far this entire concept has come over just 2 generations. And I think it's the surface level thinking that contributes to the idea of Pokemon gimmicks in its derogatory sense. I know Wolfie has also said he thought it was a really good form for competitive, which I'm just kind of bringing up to like hopefully add to my case. I'm not like the only one that actually likes these forms. Look, they're not simply a ploy to grab the player's attention. By Gen 8, power forms had established themselves as part of the game. And you can think of these forms as just a further improvement to functional mechanics. And in this case, it got wrapped in, once again, a new package. The result is a mechanic that keeps players transfixed with the series while also making meaningful incremental changes to enhance player satisfaction. Generation 9. Okay, so before we get to the final new mechanic, I want to share with you the original quote that the intro of the video took inspiration from. I started reading the Stormlight Archive in the summer of 2024, and more than anything in that series, this one quote has just stuck with me it really influenced my own like personal creative endeavors. In book 1 of the Stormlight Archive, Way of Kings, we see the character Wit explore the idea of creativity. He says, "Is it the intellect of a genius that we revere? If it were their artistry, the beauty of their mind, would we not laud it regardless of whether we'd seen the product before? But we don't. Given to works of artistic majesty, otherwise weighted equally, we will give greater acclaim to the one who did it first. It doesn't matter what you create. It matters what you create before anyone else. So it's not the beauty itself we admire. It's not the force of intellect. It's not invention, aesthetics, or capacity. The greatest talent that we think someone can have seems to me that it must be nothing more than novelty." This resonates with me so hard on a creative level. I really fully agree with it. And it's something I've really tried to keep in mind with the channel this current year, where I feel like we've been putting out these larger sort of essay styled videos. And I think it perfectly represents the struggle that the Pokemon franchise has faced. It's the struggle between familiarity and innovation that so many big titles face. This guy right here, Nifty Smith, this is also me. This is my Minecraft channel. It's a huge issue with that game as well. It's not just an issue with Pokemon. I just really hope that this video has helped to highlight the struggle that Game Freak faces at this point in time. With that said, let's see how Game Freak managed to innovate in Generation 9. Terrestrialization is in spirit, yet another twist on the power form. Terra changes the Pokemon's typing to a singular type, giving it the stab bonus of said type. So if a water flying Gyarados goes Terra Dragon, its Dragon moves get a 1.5 times stab boost and it's now Dragon type. But if it tears into water, it now gets a 2 times damage boost from stab, while in both cases retaining the 1.5 times stab boost on flying moves. Terra Function can only be used once per battle on a single Pokemon, but once the Pokemon terras, it does remain in that state until it faints. It's different from past power forms, but at its core, it's still just giving offensive and defensive boosts to a Pokemon. Like giving Gyarados 2 times stab boost on water moves isn't functionally all that different from like letting it use a Z move or giving it, 20 extra attack in Mega Evolution. It's all the same outcome, just with different methods of getting there. It is also probably worth noting that Megas and Z moves both require a held item on the Pokemon in order to actually use the function, while Gmax and Terraforms can be activated regardless of item on any Pokemon in your party. And that sort of spreads the love across the tiers even more. But unlike the predecessors, I do think that Terra for the first time feels like more of just a side grade than a pure enhancement. That's to say, I don't know if Gmax and Dynamax are better than Terras. They're just flavorfully different. And that does make me worried for the future, because while I think that Terraforms are awesome, I start to fear, like, how many more times can you do something new? Maybe the next power form can play off of abilities. Maybe you just find a way to balance one of like Megas or something. But at the end of the day, there's only so many ways you can repackage what are ultimately just power forms. And I do understand the player perception that this form is getting a little like, okay, we just had to do the same thing, but again. But it's like, again, if we just assume power forms are here to stay, can you really be mad with how well Terras are implemented into Gen 9? Like, I think you'll just be happier if you take a step back and think about how clunky Gen 6 Megas are to how clean Gen 9 Terras are. Terras feel like a fully cohesive part of the experience, from boss fights to raid battles and everything in between. It brings dynamic balancing to Pokemon, makes every gym leader and major battle feel more exciting, and it's just very organic within the region. So, in today's Pokemon environment, gimmick has become synonymous with flashy, cheap mechanics. And in Game Freak's vision to forever innovate, Megas started what was kind of a bad trend. But if you unpack things a bit deeper, you can see that every form has evolved, either becoming more refined, balanced, or dynamic than the previous. And I think the entire idea of the stigma of gimmicks shows our unawareness of what we as players actually want. And so look, I for one respect the hell out of Game Freak for just managing to come up with new stuff over the course of 9 generations. Now guys, thank you so much for making it all the way through this one. As for the giveaway, if you would like to be entered to win a copy of the A, all you have to do is just comment, what do you think the next power form might be, if there even is one at all. Also, please subscribe to the channel. And thanks again to SpexySpot for sponsoring the video. Make sure to check out the C7 Max down below. If you have a limited budget, you can check their C5 chair with solid build quality and more basic functions. There's also the C7 Morpher, which brings some more additional great features. Thank you guys so much. We'll see you soon. Peace.